behalf of Festival co-directors Namita Gokhale and William Dalrymple, and all my colleagues at Teamwork Arts, welcome back to JLF's Brave New World. We thank you all for watching the Brave New World series, and we would love to hear your feedback on the sessions and this initiative. JLF's Brave New World brings you ideas, innovations, analysis, geopolitics, economics, and so much more. And in case you've missed watching our sessions with Nobel laureates, Booker Prize, and Pulitzer Prize winners, and so much more, please view them on our Facebook page, JLF Litfest, and on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. Our official radio partner is Red FM, Bajate Raho. Our session today is the Ocean of Geopolitics. Sanjeev Sanyal in conversation with Vikram Chandra. Economist, urban theorist, historian Sanjeev Sanyal and journalist Vikram Chandra navigate across the choppy waters of the Indian Ocean through the past and present. Seeking perspectives through the lens of geopolitics, they speak of trade routes and the maritime leverage that is attached to them, especially in these conflicted times. Sanjeev Sanyal is an internationally acclaimed economist and best-selling author. He is currently the principal economic advisor to the Government of India and also serves as the co-chair of the G20 Framework Working Group. His best-selling books include Land of the Seven Rivers, The Indian Renaissance, and The Ocean of Churn. Vikram Chandra, most of you will know, is the founder of Editor G Technologies, a startup that seeks to transform video news through innovation in user experience using artificial intelligence. Chandra was also one of India's best-known TV news anchors, presenting the Big Fight, 9 o'clock news, Gadget, Guru, Klenathon, Greenathon, and Save Our Tigers. He has a keen interest in the Indian Ocean for the past 10 years. Please do remember to comment and ask questions by typing it into the comment section below. And in case any of you drop off due to bandwidth issues, you can find us on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. And in case we drop off, remember, just hang in there and we'll be right back. Ladies and gentlemen, the Office of Geopolitics, Sanjeev Sanyal in conversation with Vikram Chandra.
Thank you so much for that, and it's great to be here. And Sanjeev Sanyal, it's a particular pleasure to do this talk with you. The Indian Ocean has been an area of particular passion and particular interest for me, including the subject of what India should do to get back to what was once its historical position of dominance in an ocean which is the only ocean that actually bears the name of a single country, which is why your book, The Ocean of Churn, I have to say, is one of the most fascinating accounts of the history of this entire region and the Indian Ocean in particular. So thank you so much for doing this. First of all, the importance of the Indian Ocean. I mean, we are always grounded by the recent history of the times we are coming from. So there's been so much talk about the Atlantic, which was so powerful and so important in the first part of the 20th century. And then there was so much talk about the Pacific. But for a large part of human history, actually it was the Indian Ocean that was perhaps the most important ocean of them all. And now maybe we are getting back to that with the Indo-Pacific and concepts like that.
You're absolutely right, Vikram, and thanks for agreeing to do this talk with me, and a big thanks to Sanjay and his team. You're absolutely right. For almost all of human history, the Indian Ocean has been kind of the fulcrum of the world economy, fulcrum of global geopolitics. And while maybe in the last 150 years, the Atlantic and the Pacific have kind of come up in importance, almost the rest of all of history is about the Indian Ocean. And of course, India, by its its location, has been at the center of this of all of this. Whether it's in terms of what's happening in Southeast Asia, all the way through to Korea and Japan and China, but also towards the West, whether it's linked through to the Roman Empire. The geopolitics of the early medieval period is all about trying to capture, trade routes to India, and ultimately, of course, European expansionism. I mean, Columbus set off westward and found the Americas. He was actually looking for India. It's not by chance. I mean, the Indian Ocean world was indeed the place to be.
So, when you're talking about that, and you're talking about the increasing importance of the Indian Ocean going forward, sometimes we forget as to just how much of a maritime power India once upon was. If you go back 1,000 years, look at Southeast Asia, the influence that India had was in the Indian Ocean. And again, we're grounded by recent history, where we spend all of our time talking about the British or Pakistan or China and the fights that we are having on land. We sometimes forget that historically India was a maritime power. And a lot of that is there in your book. Do you want to share some thoughts on that? Is it time for us to recapture what was once upon a time in the heyday of India, what our true destiny was, which was to look into the Indian Ocean and look beyond that, look at the countries of the Indian Ocean rim?
You're absolutely right. I mean, if you look at Indian history, we have this, we have this very terrestrial view of Indian history, continental view. It's all about invasions coming in from the northwest. That tends to dominate our view of history, and consequently, it also dominates the way we see the geopolitics of the world in terms of our relationship with our land borders with Pakistan and China. Whereas, in fact, if you read Indian history, it's so maritime. And the influence of that is there for all to see. I mean, look through Southeast Asia, for example. There is a country there called Indonesia, which has named itself after us. Its national emblem is the Garuda, Vishnu's Garuda. Its currency is the rupiah. I mean, it's consciously modeled itself as a civilizational nation on India and its influence. The largest Hindu temple is even today in Cambodia, the Angkor Wat. Singapore is Singhapura, the Lion City. But that's just not in Southeast Asia. You can go even further east. Korean history, for example, starts with the marriage of a local prince to a princess from Ayodhya. You look at Japan, its culture has been hugely influenced by Buddhism, of course, but lesser appreciated by Hinduism. The word Shinto, for example, is Hindu or Sindhu. So if you go to a Shinto temple, we very often find a Saraswati or a Ganesha there. So there is enormous influence eastward, but also westward. So there is, the geopolitics of the early medieval period is very much about the Ethiopians fighting against the Iranians, the Persian empires, for control over Oman and Yemen. And subsequently, of course, the rise of the Arabs. Why did the Arabs become so powerful all of a sudden? Because they suddenly came in control of both the routes, the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea, and consequently, all trade, the world trade had to go through their hands. So you look at it in any way, India has been at the middle of all of this. And if you want to understand Indian history, you've got to understand the importance of the maritime orientation of our history.
So let's talk about that a little bit and talk about what's almost been a deliberate or not so deliberate withdrawal of India from its what was once its area of influence. As I say, it's called the Indian Ocean. It was once India's ocean, and then we withdrew from it. Let's look east first and then look west as to some of the aspects of that. Looking east, you're absolutely right when you're saying that. Look at Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Bali. Of course, we all know so much about Thailand, Vietnam. There was an Indian presence in all of these areas. I mean, China talks so much right now about, we should have Egypt, we should have Tibet, and we should have X, and we should have Y, and the South China Sea because of historical claims. Historically, India's presence all across Southeast Asia, there's literally physical testaments to that in the temples and the names, and Ayodhya, the names of the rulers of all of these places. India's presence is all over there. Are we seeing signs now that India is finally shedding its diffidence and realizing again that this is where we need to move to? We're hemmed in by the Himalayas on one side, Pakistan by the other side. Land has got only that much which we want to offer. Let's go back into these areas.
I think in the immediate post-independence era, we closed ourselves in many, many ways. I mean, whether it's the import substitution approach to the economy, but also our worldview became much more inward looking. And this is sad because in some ways, awkwardly, during the colonial period, actually India had over time become much more linked and had been, in fact, if anything, re-establishing its ancient links with the Indian Ocean world. So they were Indian communities in Malaysia and Singapore. There were Indian communities building up in Africa and so on, areas where in ancient India they had been traveling. But immediately after independence, that sort of British Empire anchor to our to this part of the world broke down, and it broke down in I would say in an unhappy way. I mean, you had Idi Amin throwing out the Indians from Uganda. You had a similar thing happening in Burma. People forget that there was a significant Indian population in Burma which was just was essentially thrown out, and so on and so forth. So it as the British Empire collapsed, it was not in any way replaced by us. And I have to say, to some extent, the blame must go to the policymakers of that time. Take, for example, the Middle East.
Gwadar, I mean, Middle East is fine. Take Gwadar. They were offering it to India, and we sort of said no to Gwadar. Oman had the rupee as a legal tender. The UAE had rupee as a legal tender till the 60s, and for some reason we allowed that influence to dissipate.
You're absolutely right. So, the legal tender in much of the Gulf countries was the Indian rupee. And this was true into the 60s when India effectively began to discourage its use more widely. So, ironically, it is we who actually pulled out. Same thing you just mentioned about Gwadar. Oman offered it to India first. And of course, when we didn't show enough interest, they sold it to the Pakistanis. So, this was sad because after withdrawing in the 60s, we then attempted in the 70s to re-engage, but then we almost had to do it as supplicants because we wanted oil, we wanted Indians to go there and work, and so on. But that was a completely different relationship then. So there was a reset which worked against us.
Obviously, when we're talking about the Indian Ocean in the context of the present or the future, it's always going to be in terms of the competition with China. But one of the interesting things is that it's not something which is particularly new. If India retreated from the oceans in the early, let's say 700 or 800 years ago, it was partly self-imposed because we said, caste, you lose your caste if you go out onto the seas. It was partly because China under Zhang Zhe and others came into the Indian Ocean, almost pushed everyone out. Perhaps opened the doors, as you've written in your book, for the colonialists, but Indian-Chinese competition is not something which is happening for the first time in this ocean.
You're absolutely right. So India and China as civilizations and the civilization empires that existed at various points in time have competed with each other in multiple ways. And the Indian Ocean has, not surprisingly, and Southeast Asia have been a part of that competition. So I'll give you a flavor of two periods on which this has happened, and you will immediately see how different things were between, say, the Chola period with the 11th century and by the 15th century, how things had completely changed. So just bear with me while I tell you the two stories. So if you went back to the early 11th century, world trade was essentially about trade from Fatimid-ruled Egypt to the Chola Empire, which controlled most of southern India and Sri Lanka, and then through Southeast Asia to Song Empire in China. And this trade eastward used to go through two major straits. One was the Malacca Straits, which is between what is now Malaysia and Sumatra, and the other was the Sunda Strait, which went through Java and Sumatra. Now, typically, the Sunda Straits was controlled by the Javanese, and the Malacca Straits was controlled by the Srivijaya Empire of Sumatra. So that was the balance of power, so to speak. Now, in the very beginning of the 11th century, I think around about 1014 or thereabouts, the Javans began to threaten the Sumatrans. And the Sumatrans signed up with the Song Empire in China for support. And so they got a lot of Chinese support, and they began to push the Javans out. And they were so successful that they suddenly came in control of both the straits. And like any monopolist, what they did is they began to extract rent, i.e. high taxes on trade going between India and China. Now, this is something, not surprisingly, irritated the Cholas, who controlled southern India. And they sent in 1017, they sent a sort of warning fleet to sort of suggest that they shouldn't be doing this, but it didn't work clearly. because in 1025, at about exactly the same time that Somnath was being sacked, by the way, by Mahmud Ghazni, Rajendra Chola sent this massive fleet from Nagapattinam through the Sunda Straits and then into the Malacca Straits and sacked all the Srivijaya ports. And then the main battle was fought on the mainland in Kadaram, which is modern Kedah in Malaysia. And then the Srivijayan Empire, army was completely demolished. And then the fleet came back. Now, the Cholas didn't attempt to conquer Southeast Asia. What they did, however, do is they established control enough that these two straits became open and trade was reestablished.
Yeah.
Also interesting is what the Chinese did in response. Now, clearly the Srivijaya were their allies and vassals. Interestingly, they did nothing. Now, why they did nothing is unclear, but it's quite possible that they were just as irritated by the rent extraction by the Sumatrans. But it is known that a few years later, the Cholas and the Srivijaya sent a joint embassy to the Song court. So clearly, it was something that the Chinese accepted. So
the first battle in a sense was India won China's hero, if you like to say. That was that entire.
We don't quite know. It certainly was the case that India did push back Chinese influence, and the Chinese understood it because it suited their cause as well. We don't know.
But the second one was where the Chinese were able to. India did pull back to the land, and then when Zhang Zhe and the treasure fleet and all came, then after that, that really set the stage almost for a colonization of India.
So now I'll tell you about the second story, which is somewhat different. Now the Chola Empire collapsed, and then of course we had the Turkic invasions, which basically tore apart much of southern India, Malik Kafur and so on, destroying the empires there. And you see Indian naval power also kind of shrink as a result of this. Now, by the time you arrive at the beginning of the 15th century, by the way, just to say that just at the time that the Turks were invading India, just a little bit after that, the Mongols did pretty much the same thing to both the Arabs on one side. They sacked Baghdad, and they also sacked and destroyed the Chinese Song Empire. So this entire universe I described in my first part of my talk was completely demolished by Central Asian invaders. But China and the Arabs, but here we're talking about the China, by the early 1400s, they had come back under the Ming. And the Ming began to fund these huge maritime expeditions into the Indian Ocean, led by a very unlikely person, a Muslim eunuch admiral called Zheng He. And he led these huge treasure fleets into the Indian Ocean. And after a while, they were massive. Some of their ships were big by modern standards. And put it in perspective, they were 4 to 5 times the size of Vasco da Gama's ships. So these were huge.
400 feet, I think, was his lead ship, as compared to Christopher Columbus's 85 feet or something.
Yeah, so they were huge. And each of them had something like 20 to 25,000 people in each one of these expeditions. So these are not trivial expeditions. And they turned up in the Indian Ocean, and they began to change kings and move pieces around over a period of time. And they tried, I think, semi-successfully to replace the king of Sri Lanka, for example. They also backed the Islamization of Malacca, and they backed it against the Majapahit kings of Indonesia and pushed them back. That is how the Majapahit culture ended up in Bali. When you go to see the Hindu culture in Bali, that is originally the Majapahit culture of Java. So they began to move all these pieces around. And if you had been there in 1440, you would have said, this is certainly the next century or more is going to be the Chinese period, because they simply were vastly more powerful than everyone else. But what is interesting is that domestic politics got in the way. So the old emperor died, and a new emperor came to the throne. And the new emperor had the backing of the Confucian bureaucrats, the Mandarins. And the Mandarins hated the eunuchs who controlled the navy. Now, because they disliked each other, there was a court intrigue, and the bureaucrats did what all bureaucrats would do under the circumstance. They switched off the money.
And I mean, from you, that's really interesting. You are, as the principal economic advisor to the government, you know what happens if you start switching off money.
And then, of course, the Navy just died. The Chinese Navy actually rotted in the ports. And their records of these voyages were actually suppressed to such an extent that even the Chinese themselves more or less forgot about it. It was only in the 20th century that we began to rediscover them.
Yeah.
And so there was this massive withdrawal of Chinese power. So the Chinese had come into the Indian Ocean, knocked down everybody else, particularly the Indonesians, who by this time were very powerful. So they knocked down the Indonesians, but also everybody else, the Arabs and everybody else, and then suddenly withdrawn for extraneous reasons. So this is the context in which Vasco da Gama turned up in the Indian Ocean. Now you wonder why the Portuguese, with just a handful of ships, were able to take over the whole Indian Ocean within a few short years. Well, because the Chinese had been there and they had withdrawn.
So the Indian naval power after the Cholas and others had already withdrawn partly. Then the Chinese came in, they withdrew, and then the Europeans came, and the rest is history, and it's known history. So I'm going to sort of try and skip back a little bit to the present time, because history, I think you're fond of saying that history may not repeat itself, but it rhymes. So some of what is happening right now is rhyming with that. And let's just take one example, the Malacca Straits that you were talking about. Way back, right? Chola dynasty time, what's going to happen to the Malacca Straits and who's going to control it was a major issue. If there is one thing that the Chinese would be scared of today, and the one pain point that India has over China, it is we can plug the Malacca Straits anytime that we really choose to. And that's like it's the place where your granduncle was once, I think, imprisoned, the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. India has potentially 5 unsinkable aircraft carriers in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. And I don't know if it's just a coincidence, but once the government had announced a week or 10 days ago that we are going to build up these 5 or 6 potential bases, 2 days later came the news that the Chinese are talking and withdrawing from Galwana. Maybe it's a coincidence, maybe it's not. But it's again an indication that the Indian Ocean is where India's power is potentially the greatest. Your ability to pressurize other people is the greatest. The Andaman and Nicobar Islands in particular, like has happened in the past, if you think again the way what used to happen through history, you say, okay, we will build up the Andaman and Nicobar Islands and these 4 or 5 bases, and we will have China or anybody else under pressure. So that's the way you should learn from history and apply it now.
So, I have to be careful about what I say about contemporary events. As you can imagine, I'm a government official.
This was announced by the government 1 week ago, so it's fine. I mean, they did say yesterday.
But I will not go into what may or may not imply. But what I will say, that if you take as a writer, I can quite easily say that if you look at the history of the world, every power that has been kind of controlled global economy has at some point or the other attempted to control Malacca Straits, and specifically the town of Malacca, which was the key to it, after which it's named. So I talked, of course, about the Cholas sacking it, but there was also, when the Portuguese turned up, they made a beeline for Malacca and they conquered it. So if you go to Malacca, there is a Portuguese period. And then the Dutch conquered it a little bit from the Portuguese when they were at their height. And then, of course, the British conquered it from the Dutch, and so on and so forth. The point I'm making to you is controlling that strait is not a trivial thing. And in fact, the rise of Singapore is all to do with trying to control one end of it. And why did they do that? Well, because the East India Company was exporting opium from India to China, so they had to go through the strait. So Singapore is the result of trying to control the strait. Now, that's one end of the Malacca Strait. The other end of the Malacca Strait, of course, is the Andaman Islands. So we are sitting on the other side. We are sitting on this sort of the counterpoint to Singapore in the Andamans. And of course, there is another choking point in the Indian Ocean, which is on the other side, which is with Aden. And of course, there, the Chinese already have a base in Djibouti. So there is a history, a long history to that as well.
Well, in the history with Djibouti, it's, again, you're talking about missed opportunities, but there's no such thing as a permanently missed opportunity. Maybe India has historically in the period since independence neglected our own history, our own the lessons of thousands of years to say that look, there's a reason why this is called the Indian Ocean, but it can be repaired. I mean, like when we're talking about, I mean, look, the importance of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands can be seen by anybody who opens Google Maps, right? That's all you've got to do. Open it up, zero into the naval base, INS Bars at Campbell Bay, see where it is situated, and anybody can figure out why it's going to be important, or Comorta, or Cohasa, or Port Blair, or Car Nicobar. That's obvious. But there are other countries whom India may have ignored to some extent, ancient allies, people who could be friends of ours, people who are still friends of ours, and who help in exactly the themes that you're talking about and where history helps. I'm talking about the Seychelles, I'm talking about the Maldives, Mauritius, Australia, Cocoa Islands. If you look at Andamans and look at Oman and the possible things that can happen out there with Sirocco, there are lots of things that can potentially be done if we want to.
So you're right, and this is very important. People don't understand the extent to which mental maps guide the way we think.
Yeah.
For example, Australia hasn't moved anywhere in millions of years. It's right there. But we had historically thought of it as a Pacific nation. It's only very recently when we began to rethink ourselves as an Indian Ocean country that we suddenly noticed, hey, Australia is actually an Indian Ocean country. Not only that, it's after India, it's the second largest Indian Ocean economy. And there's lots they have that we need, for example, natural resources. And it's very recently that we have begun to think in these terms. So the same thing, for example, is also true of, for example, Oman. I mean, people may not think that Oman is a particularly important place, but just look at a map. I mean, it's extremely important strategically. And ironically, it is a country with which we have traded for 6,000 years. The earliest sites in Oman are in the interiors, and they are copper mines. And if you go to those copper mines, there are these beehive kind of structures, and they have been digging in them. And guess what you find in them? You find Harappan seals, Harappan weights and measures, Harappan seals, and so on. So these are people with whom we have a very long relationship. And so you ask anybody about what is traditional Omani food. It's got rice in it, by the way. It's entirely rice-based. Now, how can that possibly be? Because you can't possibly be growing rice in Oman. Well, because they've been trading with us for so long that their traditional food is essentially imported, is based on importing from India.
That's that, and you're right, and that's true all across the Indian Ocean rim. I mean, Zanzibar, India was trading with Zanzibar hundreds of years ago. Even today, you may think that Seychelles is a small country best known for beaches and a great holiday. Look at its location on the map. Look at Mauritius. And interestingly, other countries, you mentioned Australia, there are other countries which you don't traditionally think of Indian Ocean powers, but I'm glad that India has now started to talk to them and the possibility of using their bases, such as France. I mean, Reunion. Nobody thinks of France as the Indian Ocean power, but they do have Reunion. They have other places which can be. So at least that thinking, I suspect, is starting, and it's somewhat overdue.
It's something that we should have done right from the beginning. But for a variety of reasons, we had this very terrestrial view of the world, land-based view of the world. I'm very pleased that we have begun to have a much more maritime view, and it will allow us to begin to do very interesting things. For example, there is an island just off the coast of Yemen called Socotra. Now, the name comes from Sanskrit. It comes from the name Dvipa Sukhdara. Sukhdara means the island of bliss. And it was an island, by the way, the earliest mentions of it, even in Greek and Roman things, mentioned large Indian community living there. Now, nobody thinks about this. Again, look at it on a map. You will see how important a place it is. There are this, and we are only now thinking geostrategically. These are important in multiple ways in terms of the amount of trade we can do and many other ways. Re-establishing contacts with these places is important. And there is a residual respect for India in these countries in many ways, which we are not leveraging, or we have just about started to leverage. For example, our relationship with the UAE. It has grown leaps and bounds in recent years, but it is based on a very deep links going back to a very early period. So there's something we underestimate a lot, and we do the same thing incidentally when we in terms of course, one thing I'll add here, we have to also be very careful not to overplay this ancient linkages, and I'll tell you why. To the extent we do recognize it, i.e. when somebody just suddenly discovers that there is an Indian link, we tend to sort of present it as if India handed over civilization to many of these places in Southeast Asia and so on. This is unfortunately the flip side. Either we ignore it, but the few who do look at it kind of see ourselves as sort of giver of civilization. That's also not a good idea, because much of this Indian Ocean civilization is a shared civilization. Many things we consider to be Indian are actually imports from these countries. I'll give you one example. Eating pan. Both the pan leaf and the supari are actually imports from Southeast Asia. And we have naturalized it here. So this is a shared civilization. We have to be very careful, while we do play a very central role in it, not to overplay it in order to be overbearing about our role in this whole ecosystem.
I'm sure you and others, if you're looking at that, yes, that ancient linkage and the rest of it, do you think there's a lot of economic value that countries like Indonesia and Vietnam and others are fast rising powers? They were our really close trading partners, right? We used to send things by ship to a certain point, transport them on land across the Isthmus of Kra, and then again ship it across to Vietnam. Do you think there is a lot of scope, given what's happening economically, forget about geostrategically, where that sort of a bond with ASEAN and others can be rebuilt?
So the reason there were links in the ancient times was geography, and the geography remains the same. So I think that is true. I mean, if you look at our current growth in terms of our own economic linkages, links with the Middle East, or for example, even with Singapore, have grown leaps and bounds. There are large Indian communities living there. We get huge amount of remittances there, but even our exports, particularly goods exports, goes to these countries in these areas. So I think there is a big case of our building on this. India's, for example, you look at where does our energy come from? It comes from the Gulf, where a lot of our remittance comes from the Gulf. A lot of our exports in terms of foodstuffs, etc., agriculture exports, all of this goes to the Gulf. So there are always been historical links, and they continue to be modern links of today. And interestingly, they are also they will always play into the geopolitics of whichever time it happens to be, in our time or in later times as well. So I don't think we can wish it away. Our problem is we have, in recent history, not been adequately adding into our mind space. As I told you, the intellectual frame of reference is very important. If your intellectual frame of reference is a continental one, then Australia is irrelevant to it. You begin to think of it yet somewhere out there in the Pacific. It's not. It's right next door to you in the Indian Ocean. So the same thing is that when you think of Africa, you can think of it as a gigantic continent, but some part of it is right next door and some part of it is very, very far away. So the mental frame is very, very important.
I think that's absolutely correct, and I'm starting to now see questions coming in, so I'm going to take it. Why is exploring history from the angle of the sea, maritime history, not given primary importance? I think that's a question from Arun, and that's pretty much what we are talking about. When we think of history, when we think of what's happening around it, even when we think of geography, we all remember what Vajpayee said, that you can choose your friends but not your neighbors. We tend to think of neighbors, yes, there's Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, Nepal and Bhutan, that's fine. But when we think of neighbors, it's quite often, oh my God, we got Pakistan up there, and what a troublesome neighbor we've got, and there's China, and what a troublesome neighbor we have. But if you think about it, all of these, the Indian Ocean is really where our neighborhood is. And there we do have lots of benefits. So geography need not only be bad for India because it's given us Pakistan next to us. It can be good also. We've got the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, which is India, and you're sitting right there on the mouth of the Malacca.
And we tend to forget the Lakshadweep.
That's closer here, and maybe not quite as strategic a location, the mouth of the Malacca, but I take your point, yes. So this question that Arun is asking, when you're looking at history, why is it that maritime history is not given enough importance?
Well, it's a complicated debate, and I have spoken on this at length. But there may be a very simple, the simplest answer I can give to you is that after independence, our capital happened to be in Delhi. Sitting in Delhi, we ended up thinking of our history in terms of purely these land-based northern empires, as if somehow that was what drove everything in history. So you know, you will read our history textbooks and you learn about obscure dynasties like the Lodhis, but you learn almost nothing about the Cholas, the Pallavas, the Chalukyas, and so on, who were southern empires. I think this is again is probably a capture of history just by virtue of being fact that our capital happens to be Delhi. If it happened to be Mumbai, maybe our history books would have been written in a completely different way.
Yeah, that's true. That's actually very valid. Or Chennai, for that matter, when you would have been really thinking about the Indian Ocean and the Southeast Asia far more. Ajit asks, how important is the Indian Ocean for China's string of pearls strategy, and how is it a threat to India? Well, we've been also talking about an Indian string of pearls that'll make China's life difficult. But yes, people talk more about the Chinese string.
Well, as I said, as a government official, I can't get into too many details, so I'll let Vikram really take that. All I will say is, any sport is played by both sides. It's not only one side that can have moves.
Well, I mean, I know you can't talk about it, but I think we've been discussing some of this, Ajit, a little earlier, and it's obviously the Chinese string of pearls are a threat to India, but India does have advantages. Let's not forget, you've heard us talking about the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. You have Australia as an ally, France as an ally, Maldives, Seychelles. You could actually put bases all across the Indian Oceans, or places of Indian influence all across the Indian Ocean, which makes it virtually impossible for the Chinese or anybody else to traverse. Not just the Malacca Strait. If you've got the Sunda Strait, if you've got Indonesia as an ally, Australia as an ally, you can have something on the Coco Islands. It's very easily doable to really give China a headache, and a headache such that they will find it very difficult to come into the Indian Ocean. So there is a problem they can have. You can keep talking about Gwadar and the rest of it, but India does have a response to this, and it's for us, I think, to take it over. Well, similar question, Om Prakash Parikh says, China has taken one strategic port in Sri Lanka. Is that a great threat to India? I mean, I know Sanjeev can't talk about some of the stuff he is in. Threat, yes. Is it something that can be countered? Yes. Ambat Tota is not really a naval police right now.
I'll just add here that one of the things that you have to remember about OBOR or any such kind of approach is, do remember, one, nobody loves their banker. So running up debts of large debts is not with another country doesn't necessarily mean that you are going to necessarily love your creditor. So it is a double-edged sword. Secondly, as other empires of history have discovered, you can build infrastructure, outposts, and other things in any way you like, but some point in time you will have to defend it. So when you begin, what happens in the longer term, you build large infrastructure. And this is not just about the Chinese. It's true for everybody. If we want to play this game, we will face it too. You put infrastructure and other things, and the politics of that time or the economics of that time in that particular place suddenly turns against you. What do you do in that place? Many colonization in the end wasn't, British colonization, for example, didn't start out with a grand plan of how to take over all these places. It started out with trying to control certain bits, and they ended up controlling a little bit more because it made sense at that point in time, and so on and so forth. And it then became essentially unwieldy and collapsed on itself. And all empires ended up like that. So this is a messy business. China want to go down that path? I don't know.
And I think, to take your point forward, again, if you look at the lessons of history, if you overextend yourself very far away, it's tougher to do it. If India has the ability India has the ability to make the entire Indian Ocean a sphere of influence, extending all the way out to the Andaman and Nicobar Islands and Mauritius and places like that, any port that China may have in Sri Lanka or Bangladesh, Sri Lanka in particular, you're really talking about something 2,000 kilometers into India's sphere of influence, right off the Indian coast. not that quite that easy to do. All right, Sachdev Ramkrishnan asks, should India have a look eastward or a look westward policy around the Indian Ocean from a geopolitical strategy standpoint? So east or west or both?
Well, I think we should stop thinking in these terms altogether. If we are going to think of the Indian Ocean, you have to know that the Indian Ocean is a pretty integrated, not just historically, but in many other ways. There is, remember, it's not just us playing it as a player in there. Indonesia is also trading with Africa. Africa is trading with Singapore. Dubai has dealings with Singapore. So this is an integrated system, and we are a part of it, maybe an important part of it, but we are a part of a wider ecosystem. So I think that is the more useful way of thinking about it, rather than to think of us there and either choosing to look east or west. This is an ecosystem in which we have to play the game both ways, but and the others in this ecosystem will also be doing their own thing as well. I mean, Australia will have its own dealings with Indonesia, for example. And we have to stop having this idea that we have to choose which direction we look. This is an ecosystem with all its own logic, and we have to participate in it whole hog.
All right, I think I'm going to take one last question before we run out of time in the session. Neha Das Gupta, do you think the Indian Ocean region is the emergent power in world affairs today, and how should India build on past relations for the future? Well, I think that's what we almost spent 45 minutes talking. So Indian Ocean as an emergent power, or just to add to that, before I throw it to you, is it going to be Indo-Pacific, which seems to be the flavor of the season?
Yes, I mean, the game today is the Pacific. In the 19th century and the early 20th century, it was the Atlantic. But there will be a transition, even if it does come into the Indian Ocean area. There is no doubt that the Pacific will, for the time being, be the more important and dominant relationship between China and the US. But the very fact that the Indo-Pacific has been added into it tells you the way this ecosystem of economics and geopolitics is spilling over to us. Now, it's nothing in history is inevitable. To some extent, it is for us in India to make it happen. Our importance of the Indian Ocean is dependent, at least part, on what India does and how we respond to the opportunities that we have. So, it is one thing I will say is that we need to go out and embrace this. We cannot do what we did after the decline of the Cholas, which is to look inward. That is not an option. It did not help us in the 13th century. It's not going to help us now.
Right. I think that's very well summed up. If we want the Indian Ocean to become the emergent power, if we want it to be an Indo-Pacific and not a Pacific, but it's really up to India to anchor its leg, if you like, of that entire continuum and figure out how the Indian Ocean is a place which will be rising, and where India's role in that to make it, I don't know if you want to call it India's ocean, but certainly make sure that India has a very important role to play in the Indian Ocean. I think we are out of time. Sanjeev, Sanyal, thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to toss it back to Sanjoy and the others.
Thank you so much, Vikram Chandra. Thank you so much, Sanjeev. Sanyal. As you rightly said, there's no permanent mistakes as far as history goes, and we can revisit the issues around the Indian Ocean. I know my father, if he was alive, would have embraced both of you hugely. Admiral Roy spent much of his time knocking on the doors of the mandarins in South and North Block, writing many books on the Indian Ocean and hoping that they would listen to his plea that they had to act. But hey, better late than never. Thank you both, and thank you all for watching. I'm sorry we couldn't take all of the questions, but should you wish to know more about the Indian Ocean and its history, Sanjeev's books are absolutely brilliant, and they're available, I think, on Amazon, right, Sanjeev?
Yes, that's right. Amazon and Flipkart, most platforms.
And across bookshops. Of course, there's no airport bookshops anymore, but certainly bookshops in your neighborhood and across the world, it's on Amazon, so go out and buy it. Thank you very much, Vikram, and thank you for bringing us Editor G, and thank you for joining us in this conversation. This is a whole new age of news, and I hope You all will join us again at 8:30 for our next session. If All the World and Love Were Young, Stephen Sexton in conversation with Gillian Canning, that uncovers the core of poetic imagination. Stephen Sexton explores his acclaimed debut poetry collection about love, loss, memory, childhood, imagination, and grief. Sexton's verse conveys the anguish of a mother's death through the levels of the classic video game Super Mario World. See you at 8:30. Thank you to our radio partner, Red FM. Bajate Raho.